Scampia di Napoli, ed è un progetto, un'impresa sociale piccola, però per noi qui in Campania importante e significativa, e anche a livello mio personale, per il rapporto con una parte della popolazione romani qui in Italia, come mia professione proprio geografica. E dopo questo coffee break, che è previsto formalmente da programma in 15 minuti, poi vediamo, però diciamo, non allarghiamo più oltre la mezz'ora, abbiamo le sessioni del mattino, pranziamo insieme sempre nella biblioteca Placanica, le sessioni del pomeriggio, poi chi vuole, stasera siamo a cena al ristorante pizzeria che c'è a Salerno, che è un'altra piccola attività significativa in città per l'attenzione che ha ai temi del rispetto dei contratti di chi lavora all'interno di questo luogo, perché normalmente nelle pizzerie e nei ristoranti della salernitana non c'è un grande rispetto dei contratti. E poi domani ci rincontriamo qui sempre la mattina, cominciamo alle 9:15, se non sbaglio, o 9, con le sessioni, e poi c'è il coffee break e un incontro, e poi c'è un incontro con rappresentanti di alcuni comitati e movimenti campani impegnati su questioni socio-ecologiche, 5 rappresentanti. C'è un comitato che si occupa degli incendi e altri ancora. E poi le conclusioni, in cui decideremo anche quale sarà il prossimo luogo, la prossima università in cui organizzeremo il 13° congresso. Ecco, semplicemente questo, molto semplicemente. Dico in ultima cosa, in introduzione, l'avete trovato nelle cartelline, sempre a proposito di ecologia mondo, perché alcuni dei presenti hanno una particolare attenzione in questa fase della loro vita di ricerca al tema. C'è un numero monografico, quasi monografico, cioè sostanzialmente monografico, di sociologia urbana e rurale, che è comunque una delle riviste di riferimento di chi si occupa in Italia di sociologia dell'ambiente, che è dedicato proprio al tema dell'ecologia mondo. L'hanno curato Emanuele Leonardi e Luigi Pellizzoni, e con i contributi di alcune delle persone qui presenti, tra l'altro con un'intervista a Jason, con commenti a questa intervista, che in questi giorni, per chi utilizza la rete, sono stati diffusi dal sito di Effimera e continueranno a essere diffusi gli ulteriori commenti nei prossimi 3-4-5-6 giorni. In Effimera c'è questo dibattito, compresa la traduzione in italiano dell'intervista. Questo, semplicemente questo. Ci sono i professori Pendenza e Gennaro Iorio, che sono il presidente della didattica e sociologia e il direttore del Dipartimento di Studi Politici e Sociali. Io vi ringrazio per la parola, e dopo presentiamo in 2 minuti Jason e
un breve saluto di benvenuto e di ringraziamento anche all'AIS, alla sezione di sociologia del territorio, dell'ambiente, che ha scelto anche Salerno, la nostra realtà, per questo convegno, che è un convegno di grande attualità, e devo dire anche per l'impostazione che è stata data, molto in sintonia con questa nuova realtà dipartimentale che noi abbiamo creato, in cui il momento della riflessione culturale, di ricerca scientifica, si incontra anche con i soggetti della trasformazione sociale. E quindi su questo voglio ringraziare voi, in modo particolare il collega Gennaro Iorio. E questo tema è molto, appunto, attuale. Domani ci saranno importanti manifestazioni, ormai da più di un anno c'è un movimento dei giovani soprattutto che mondiale, che ha a cuore questo tema dell'ambiente. E il tema ambientale si coniuga sempre di più, anzi la sua radice, la questione nasce da come noi organizziamo la società, il modo di produrre, di consumare, il modo in cui organizziamo i rapporti di potere, e che l'ambiente è l'espressione anche di una crisi dell'epoca nella quale viviamo, e che ci induce a ripensare, ecco, questa gran parte degli assunti su cui la modernità è stata creata. E solo un dato mi colpiva qualche giorno fa, leggendo alcune cose, che se noi avessimo, diciamo, tutti gli abitanti della Terra avessero la stessa dieta che hanno gli americani o gli occidentali, avremmo bisogno di 4-5 pianeti Terra. È evidente che il tema della diseguaglianza, del modo in cui consumiamo, ha a che fare con la questione ambientale. E l'altra grande questione è come noi decarbonizziamo, no? Il modo di produzione, quali sono le fonti energetiche. Abbiamo soluzioni tecniche perché le energie decarbonizzate hanno anche un costo più conveniente, più basso rispetto all'uso del petrolio così diffuso, comunque delle energie fossili, e tuttavia, ecco, non riusciamo a fare questa conversione anche nei tempi che l'emergenza ci richiede. Quindi questo interroga molto il nostro modo politico, il nostro modo, le scelte che noi operiamo nell'organizzare le nostre relazioni produttive, le nostre relazioni sociali più in generale. E quindi benvenute a questa riflessione, soprattutto una riflessione che tiene insieme, come anche diceva Sennett nel suo libro, che è molto caro, che è L'uomo artigiano. La trasformazione avviene con l'alleanza, no? Tra la testa, le mani e il cuore, no? Poi è un'espressione ripresa anche da Papa Francesco, non so chi dei due abbia coniato questo trittico, comunque al di là di chi lo abbia coniato, mi pare che questa sia la strada, ecco, da seguire, e anche quindi, come dire, le mie congratulazioni e supporto a questa iniziativa che avete voluto fare qui a Salerno, di cui siamo molto orgogliosi e che siamo grati innanzitutto al collega Allora. Quindi il mio augurio di buon lavoro. Io seguirò i lavori, non da qui alla prossima ora, di questo mi scuso, ma perché ho appunto un impegno che non posso appunto mancare, però seguirò anche i lavori durante la giornata, il pomeriggio e anche domani. Quindi grazie e buon lavoro.
Grazie, buongiorno a tutti. Sono io che voglio ringraziare Gennaro per questo convegno, e vi dico subito perché, non soltanto perché ha portato, come ricordava il direttore, un bel convegno a Salerno, che non è poco, siamo nella periferia del mondo, ma vedo tanta gente, e questa cosa mi fa molto piacere, veramente molto piacere. Per la questione di metodo lo ringrazio, perché io non so adesso, tu hai fatto una partita, non so quanti sociologi ci siamo qua dentro, sicuramente ci sono sociologi iscritti all'AIS, sociologi non iscritti all'AIS e tanti altri che non sono sociologi. Bene, questa è una questione di metodo che io guardo con grande favore e grande rispetto. Mi occupo di teoria sociologica in senso stretto, ma so benissimo che la sociologia, se si chiude dentro i canoni e dentro i perimetri che si sta dando, che viene, a cui viene imposto sostanzialmente, non va da nessuna parte. La sociologia deve tornare ad essere una scienza sociale aperta, aperta alle altre discipline, e non è un modo di dire, veramente voi siete un esempio chiaro, evidente, lampante di come si può fare, diciamo, scienza sociale portando riflessioni da campi diversi e utilizzando la sociologia per aprirsi in altri campi. Questo è un metodo che va preso come esempio. Io cerco di portarlo nella sezione di cui faccio parte, ma è molto difficile far capire ai colleghi, specialmente quelli di una certa età, perché invece questo metodo secondo me è molto diffuso tra i giovani, di fare l'opposto di quello che ci viene detto. Cioè, mentre da una parte ci chiedono di specializzarci, dall'altra vedo e rilevo con grande piacere invece che si va da tutt'altra parte. Con la difficoltà che poi si incontrerà quando ci saranno gli aspetti formali da aprirtere. auspico continuamente questa apertura della sociologia. A me piace utilizzare il termine sociologia globale, utilizzando il globale non solo nel senso di sociologia del mondo globale, ma anche globale nel senso di fare una sociologia aperta alle altre scelte, quindi quel globale sta a significare olistico. E dai colleghi da voi, dei colleghi di sociologia del territorio, sta avvenendo proprio questo. Ho letto la ricchezza dei temi che vengono sviluppati e sono rimasto impressionato positivamente di questa cosa. Mi sono formato con la sociologia urbana rurale che si occupava di cose molto specifiche, oggi mi ritrovo a vedere tanta teoria sociale, sociologica dentro gli studi, ma tanta, cioè gli aspetti più interessanti di quella che un tempo era analisi dei macrosistemi dentro questa disciplina, dentro questo ambito di studio, e questo mi fa veramente molto, molto piacere. Sul contenuto, lasciatemi soltanto dire una cosa, ma questa appare ormai evidente, che la via occidentale scelta del consumo del territorio, della divisione tra natura e uomo, è una via sbagliata. Siamo ancora in tempo. E l'Occidente, non voglio fare una critica all'Occidente, ma penso che l'Occidente, così come ho sempre difeso l'Occidente contro chi appunto lo criticava per aspetti come questi, dico sempre, dico anche che l'Occidente ha i suoi anticorpi, cioè il pensiero occidentale è in grado di pensare soluzioni che siano, come dire, in controtendenza rispetto a quello che il pensiero occidentale si è costruito nel tempo. Abbiamo bisogno sì anche di altri sguardi, ma gli altri sguardi ce li abbiamo anche all'interno dell'Occidente. Quindi siamo capaci, voi siete anche un esempio, la teoria critica è un esempio, noi abbiamo inventato la teoria critica. Quindi siamo in grado di osservare gli errori e tornare sui nostri passi. La divisione tra natura e uomo è una divisione sbagliata. Sbagliata per il semplice fatto che porta al disastro, alla catastrofe. Non fosse altro per quello, non dico che ci sono aspetti etici, ci sono aspetti legati, è autodistruttiva.
Puoi alzare un po' la voce?
Io sto usando questo microfono che non funziona. Di più fa rumore. Sì. Quindi auspico sempre più, diciamo, una riflessione sui limiti e sugli errori del pensiero occidentale e sulla rivalutazione del rapporto tra natura e uomo. Bene, vi ringrazio, veramente un buon lavoro. Seguirò una parte da lavoro anch'io certamente. Grazie, buona giornata.
Yes. Now we are ready for you. I can begin now?
Yes.
La luce.
Excellent.
La luce.
Well, thank you very much for having me introduce the conference today. I am very sorry that I cannot be there in person. I fell ill and my doctor said I could not come to Italy, so I was very, very sad. So we will begin with the big question. Let me get my PowerPoint up, and is it there?
No.
Yes?
No.
Or no?
No.
No, my PowerPoint. Oh, let me try again. One moment.
It's normal that it doesn't work.
Oh.
Okay.
No, we will get this to work here. Ah, here we go.
Okay,
Now.
okay, now it works.
Now, so for the next few minutes, you can hear me talk and you will not see me, but later I will take the PowerPoint off and then we can have a conversation. So I want to begin by asking, why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism? This, of course, is a question that is asked very many times these days. And I want to suggest that the dominant environmental imaginary that has taken shape since 1968 is part of the problem. Here we have the famous Earthrise photograph from 1968. You might also think of the blue marble photograph from 1972 that hangs in the office of Al Gore, the best example we have of the environmentalism of the rich. And while this imagery is often taken to be a positive environmentalist image and politics, I want to suggest that it may be part of the problem. The whole Earth was not discovered in 1968 with Earthrise. The whole Earth was discovered in the centuries after 1492. Indeed, our earliest surviving globe is from the year 1492. And so what I want to suggest is that the whole Earth and the idea of the planetary has been an instrument of conquest and of commerce from Columbus in 1492 to the Cold War military science industrial complex that is responsible for this image and many like it. In the environmentalist imaginary, this image is cleansed of Cold War imperialism, of nuclear exterminism, of planetary management. So I want us to keep that in mind, and we're going to return to it later in this lecture. The salient geographical and geophysical fact of our times is the end of the Holocene. That 10 to 12,000 year period of relative and unusual climate stability. As we can see here, we are now moving into an entirely different era of climate history. But it's not clear what this means, and I want to try to clarify some of this. The dominant environmental imaginary that emerged after 1968 was very much a neoliberal and planetary dystopia in which the end of the world was upon us. As Paul Ehrlich, author of The Population Bomb, wrote in 1968, that rising populations will cause war and famine and every other social ill that we can imagine. What he didn't say is that capitalism had already created war and famine and every imaginable social and environmental ill. So what we need to ask about as sociologists, as social scientists, as committed intellectuals is, what is it about the epistemology, but also what is it about the geoculture of capitalism that leads us to think in terms of man and nature rather than class and power and exploitation and empire? Why have man and nature been so powerful, not just epistemologically, but as real abstractions, real conceptual guides to empire from the era of Columbus all the way through to the present moment? We can think of the post-World War II American-led development project for the world, in which all of a sudden people were discovered to be poor and in need of development, much as the Castilians in the 16th century discovered that indigenous peoples were heathens and in need of Christianity. And in both cases, civilization was the gift that was bestowed upon the savage and wild humans everywhere else in the world. So as we can see from this map, the emergence of capitalism was premised not just on conquest, not just on a mode of commerce, but on a new mode of thought and a new geoculture in which civilization and nature were these powerful guides, these real abstractions to the reordering of the world, so that women, in Federici's term, became savages of Europe. Indigenous peoples became naturales. In Africa, Africans and enslaved Africans became monsters. So this divide of man and nature was very much born of capitalist mode of intellectual production and of cultural production. Now, when we think of the modern environmental imaginary in the rich countries, we go back to this famous poster from First Earth Day in 1970. And the poster says everything. We have met the enemy and he is us. And this very much embodies the erasure of class inequality, empire, race, and gender inequalities that lay at the heart of capitalism and at the heart of capitalism's environmental history. And so we want to interrogate why it is that so often environmentalism has not only raised the question of environmental degradation, but also has very much advanced a strange kind of politics that says we are all responsible for the environmental problems around us. This ends up erasing capitalism's violent political economy, this capital accumulation based on strategies of cheap nature, and it evacuates and abstracts long histories of inequality in which inequalities of class, gender, and empire are always not just human, but human and connected to the rest of the web of life. So what I want us to open up is this question: what happens if we reconstruct climate history in the world ecological perspective? And don't worry, I'm going to show various versions of this chart, which is a set of two proxies for climate changes in the Northern Hemisphere for the past 2,000 years. What happens if we begin to ask questions in terms of power, production, and reproduction across the long journey of the past 2,000 years of climate change, with climate crisis and climate justice strategies? Much of modern social and political thought and the ways of thinking, the ways of conceptualizing, the ways of narrating our history were born in this very strange period between 1550 and 1700, which marks the worst, the most severe decades of the Little Ice Age. That is, this is the period of the long, cold 17th century. And just to remind you here of the severity of the Little Ice Age, you can see that from about 1450 to about 1830, 1840, we have a very severe Little Ice Age, and we will come back to this theme many times. What we want to become aware of is that this is the era in which Descartes, Hobbes' Leviathan, John Locke's theory of property premised on indigenous peoples being in a state of nature, all of this begins to come together in the long, cold 17th century. This was the first climate crisis of capitalism. So it becomes very important when we think of climate crisis today, of the kinds of intellectual and political revolutions that will be necessary to come to grips with a climate change that is much severe than in earlier eras. Indeed, when we think of primitive accumulation in the Marxist tradition, we have very little to work with when it comes to climate change. But in fact, the classic era of primitive accumulation, not just in England, but as we can see in Ireland and indeed across the Atlantic world in this era, was bound up with an enormous climate crisis. So what we see here, and I give you this map of the transformation of land ownership in Ireland over the 60 years of 1631 to 1703. This is important because this is not just a story of primitive accumulation that is often ignored by so-called orthodox Marxists who seem to be untroubled by the long history of empire, but also it shows us very clearly the line between civilization and savagery. This was the language of the English conquerors in Ireland, who then exported this model, transplanted this model to North America. So the Irish were wild and savage and deserved to be dispossessed not just of their lands, but of membership in humanity. They were put into the realm of nature. Here again, we see that primitive accumulation and accumulation by dispossession is fundamentally not only about class in an economic sense, it is about belief, and it is about the geocultural boundary between civilization and savagery, of course, always from the standpoint of the imperialists. Well, what to propose is that a state shift in climate, and that's the language that Earth system scientists use to talk about fundamental, irreversible, and rapid changes in the biosphere. A state shift in climate requires an intellectual state shift. What does that mean? I think at the very minimum, it means going beyond 19th century divisions of knowledge between the natural and human sciences, and then means pardon me, I'm still recovering from my illness, and then means recovering from and transcending the divisions of the social sciences. So, in order to do that, I think that we need to grasp the double character, not the dual character, but the double character of nature as a political project of capitalists, of empires, of big business owners. That's nature as a project, as a class struggle from above, and nature or the web of life as a process, which it includes all of our organizations, all of the movements of class struggle, all of the dynamics of life that are often at odds with capitalist business as usual. So that means an intellectual state shift that moves beyond man and nature. It moves beyond society and nature to understand that human social relations are always in the web of life. And that means that when we see human social relations, class, gender, empire, race, as fundamentally constituted in and through the web of life, then we begin to have a much fuller and much more adequate picture, both empirically, theoretically, and in terms of organizing for justice that cuts across the social and environmental boundaries. This means that we confront at every turn the idea that we are living in a world in which there are natural systems and human. On the one hand, of course, it is true, as I just mentioned in this previous, I forget where, as I mentioned here, that there are, of course, orbital variations. The fact the climate of planet Earth are of course, variations in the solar energy reaching planet Earth. But when we are looking at the politics of climate crisis and the history of climate crisis, we need to understand that every human system is fundamentally connected with and within webs of life. And much of the history of power, of social inequality, and also movements for justice turn on how nature and how human beings within the web of life are developing. But crucially, in world ecology, this entails a simple but also profoundly unsettling premise, which is that capitalism makes environments, but of course those environments also make capitalism. And if we take this co-productive dialectic very seriously, it begins to unsettle many of our received notions. And this is essentially an extension of an earlier geographical critique, which pointed out that capitalism does not simply occupy spaces, words, but produces them. And those spaces are in turn producing capitalism. And so this gives us a way to move from seeing societies occupying environments to seeing much more dynamic relation of production. So when we look at the history of climate change, we begin, of course, with the geophysical dynamics. And here are two proxies, one centered on fluctuations of solar intensity, and the low points are called solar minima. You can see the Vandal, famously the Maunder solar minimum in the long, cold 17th century. And then below, we see the volcanic patterns of volcanic eruption. And probably the best thing that we can look for right now is a major volcanic eruption to buy us some time to organize for climate revolution. But we want to take the climate as geophysical history and fold it, incorporate it, synthesize it with the social and economic and political and cultural moments of civilizational history. This is what I call climate history as geohistorical process. Now, I'll return to this several times, so it's not crucial that you read it all at this moment. What is important to note is that at each moment climate change, we begin to see fundamental shifts in civilizational history from 3rd century crisis all the way to the crisis of feudalism and the rise of capitalism. So what this does, and let's see, here we go. So what this points out is that climate changes are connected to what I call geohistorical crises and ecological revolutions in the conceptualization of Carolyn Burchett. That is, ecological revolutions are moments of fundamental change in the systems of production, of reproduction, of ideas and politics all at once. And so this means that we stop seeing modes of production as these abstracted relations of production and typologies, and we begin to see them as environment-making patterns and environment-making processes that are always rooted in definite relations of class, understood both in terms of production, but also in relations of reproduction, understood in a variety of different terms, not just the feminist terms, but especially the feminist terms. So this opens up a way to get beyond man versus nature. This opens up the possibility of understanding climate changes as not man versus nature, but as climate and class. Of course, it's more than these, but climate and class gives us a way to put together the geophysical with the historical and geographical relations of production and reproduction and political power. So in order to do this, we need to move from the environment to environment making, this double movement of environment making in which social relations are making environments and environments are making social relations. I think that this is the spirit of Marx when he opens that famous chapter on the labor process. And he opens that chapter with this extraordinary statement, which I won't repeat because I know many of you are familiar with it. But the last line that I quote here is very powerful to me, that through this movement of transforming external nature, the worker acts of changes not only external nature, but also his own nature and the relations of production that go with it. This gives a much different picture of Marx's ecology and of the history of capitalism than the conventional model of man versus nature, natural system, social system, and of a separation between those. It helps us to see that the relations of class and webs of life are an antagonism that is unified but in a deeply antagonistic and conflict-ridden way. So now we can come back to the geological Anthropocene. And what I'm going to do here is to remind you all that there are, in fact, two Anthropocenes. One Anthropocene is the geological Anthropocene, which says that the signals in the geological layer that will be evident billions of years from now are nuclear residues from atomic testing, plastics, and chicken bone. Lots and lots of chicken bone. And this is one of the Anthropocenes that is useful and powerful. So this Anthropocene is extraordinarily important, relevant, and necessary. But it moves very quickly into another Anthropocene, which I call the popular Anthropocene. This is the Anthropocene enforced by the Anthropocene, and this is a form of blaming the victim. I think that this is really a fundamental expression of the dominant environmental imaginary since 1968. It says, we have met the enemy and he is us, and ignores the extraordinary relations of inequality. It erases the extraordinary relations of inequality in wealth, income, and power that have caused the biospheric crisis and the climate crisis today. So we want to be very careful in engaging the popular Anthropocene because it has opened up a robust and important conversation. But we also want to point out that its central philosophical conception of man versus nature is part of the sets of relationships that have been driving climate crisis over the past 50 years and 500 years. And moreover, that in saying we've met the enemy and he is us, that we live in the age of man, and that human beings are all creating this problem together, is a way of evading and short-circuiting deeper historical reconstructions that we need in order to make sense of the climate crisis and of the politics of climate justice today. So what I would suggest is that the climate change today is not anthropogenic, made by humans. It is capitalogenic. Now, the first thing that environmentalists say is, oh, capitalocene, capitalogenic, these are ugly words, they say. But Anthropocene hardly rolls off the tongue. But really, I thought about this for a long time. What is it environmentalists and advocates of the Anthropocene don't like the capitalocene? And the fundamental reason is that they don't want to talk about capitalism. And this is also something that the Anthropocene, the popular Anthropocene, shares with this longer term environmental imaginary that goes back to 1968. So I keep repeating this because we are going to come back to it. We should remember that climate change is not anthropogenic, it is capitalogenic. And we know, for instance, the 100 companies most responsible for greenhouse gas emissions since 1850. These companies are responsible for about 70% of carbon dioxide emissions over the past 160, 70 years. All right, now the other part of the Anthropocene that connects with this earlier era from 1968 with Earthrise and the whole Earth and population bomb thinking is the creation of the global environment as a depoliticized object. It politicizes the environment in one way, also depoliticizes it by suggesting that the fixes are essentially bureaucratic, technological, or somehow about individual lifestyle choice, all of which really flies in the face of what we know about neoliberalism. One of the things that we were told over the past 40 years by the great advertising marketing systems of the planet is that consumers have this. But in fact, we know that ours is not an era of consumer sovereignty, but an era of producer sovereignty. So what I think our challenge is to take seriously the geophysical science, the Earth system science, but refuse to reduce the climate crisis question. Greenhouse gas molecules of degrees Celsius increase, of sea level rise increase, to be a form of carbon reductionism, of geophysical reductionism. We have to take it to the capital of scene. We have to take the geophysical moments and fold them into the geohistorical. And that is so important because the climate crisis is not just a matter of biodiversity, of rising sea levels. It is a matter of climate class divide, climate patriarchy, climate apartheid. And this brings us to what I think is maybe the biggest surprise in my own research and my own development of thinking, that in an era where capital seems so strong, it's important to remember that climate shifts historically are just terrible for ruling classes. Unfavorable climate shifts over the past 2,000 years signal the end of Roman power in the West in the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries. They signal the end of feudal power in the 14th century and caused extraordinary political crises from Paris to Beijing in the 17th century. So I'm going to run you through this very, very quickly. The old story of the barbarians as invasions has been challenged and interpreted many times, but one thing is clear. That Eurasia was experiencing the first drought of 2,000 years in the 4th century, pushes the Huns to the west, pushed the Goths to the west, and eventually began peaks, and along with a series of political crises within Rome, there is an extraordinary moment of climate crisis in a geohistorical sense for the Western Roman Empire. And indeed, the history of climate and the history of civilization crisis, transition, and reconstruction lead up dramatically well over this period between the Dark Ages cold period, which begins in 400, to the resurgence to the birth of feudalism in Carolingian Europe, and all the way through to the crisis of the later Middle Ages. So one of the lessons of this story is not simply that climate was bad for ruling classes, but also that, for example, in Western and Central Europe, the collapse of the Roman political economy centered on Sevilla and rather sharp class inequality allowed peasantries to reconsolidate and experience a kind of golden age in Central and Western Europe, where despite an unfavorable climate, they were able to reorganize life on more equal terms, on more diverse terms, and do things like regulate fertility in ways that were impossible in class stratified society. So again, going back to some of the core concerns of sociology, demography, and inequality, we need to be able to situate those dynamics within the long-term civilizational crisis of Rome West in this instance, but also of the possibilities and creativities of modes of production. Now we're going to fast forward 1,000 years. We're going to do a lot of time travel here in a very short period of time. The crisis of feudal Europe in the 14th century was not simply because of climate change in a mere sense. It is true that the Little Ice Age begins shortly before the year 1300. That brings with it severe winters and torrential rains. It creates the conditions for agricultural crisis, but also created the conditions of agricultural crisis for the feudal class. regime. And what breaks feudalism its knees by the end of the 14th century is popular revolt. So what we are seeing here in the early centuries of the Little Ice Age in the 14th and 15th century is a period of unprecedented climate revolt. And you can see here with a contemporary painting from the Jacques Marie in France in 1357, 1358. And this was this kind of agrarian unrest, sometimes very dramatic and large scale, 1381 in England and many other places, but oftentimes more subtle and protracted, prevented the reimposition of feudal class relations as ruling classes faced an unprecedented crisis of seigneurial revenues under the pressure of demographic collapse, climate change, and class revolt. Indeed, the origins of the modern world to be found in the historic defeat of Western ruling classes in an era of climate change. And what follows was, just as I mentioned for peasants in the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries in Western and Central Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the result was a golden age in the living standard of peasants and workers. So, how do we understand these moments of climate change as more climate determinism, less than climate determinism? How do we understand modes of production or civilizations in the web of life? How do we move from the Malthusian stories of man versus nature to a story that takes very seriously climate change, takes seriously environmental history, and moves towards climate and class? Well, let's consider that while climate history is not everything, it is connected to everything. And here you can see 6 key moments of climate change over the past 2,000 years that were fundamental to civilizational shifts over this period, indeed going all the way back to the Bronze Age crisis. So the key lessons are, of course, no civilization lasts forever. And so I think we should be careful when we overstate the resilience of capitalism in the present movement. And we should also be wary of overstating capital's resiliency in an era of climate crisis. There are a lot of reasons for this that I will touch on in the second half of the lecture. But essentially, the dynamism of capitalism produces so much capital that it has to invest somewhere. And historically, those opportunities to invest capital profitably at above average rate of profit have been found or created through great frontier movements. And this has been true for every great industrial revolution from the 16th century to the 19th century to the 20th. So we want to understand that climate change has essentially exploded that cheap nature model of going to frontiers, not only because the frontiers are today fewer than ever before, but also because climate change is making business as usual more and more expensive. And this is most clear in the recent history of agricultural revolution, where despite now 25 years of biotechnological innovation in agriculture, agricultural productivity growth continues to slow and slow and slow. So remember here that we are in this, we are now crossing the threshold from the Little Ice Age to more contemporary history. So in these moments, these are in the world, these moments of climate change, but they're moments of crisis for ruling classes. And yes, for the vast majority as well, but the vast majority quickly reconstitute themselves, and the ruling classes have a much more difficult time. Because let's face it, they don't really do anything. They're parasites and exploiters. And secondly, that we need to, I think that it might be helpful to begin to shift our thinking from collapse to talking about crisis. That these were crises of civilizations, not the collapse of civilization, and in a whole negative sense. And that climate change is always going to amplify in most productions class, reproductive, and agricultural contradictions. And that means that a bad climate for one civilization may not be bad for another. And that allows us to get to the rise of capitalism. Because the rise of capitalism presents a real puzzle. Consolidation of Roman and then feudal hegemony occurred during periods of relative warmth and favorable precipitation. But the rise of capitalism occurs during periods that have generated crisis, both for Western Rome and for feudal Europe. So the emergence of capitalism and the emergence of a highly stratified division of labor, highly stratified class structure in an era of exceedingly cold climate have to be explained. And there is profound relevance to our conjunction in the 21st century. So here I just want to remind you of the gravity of the situation, especially in the long, cold 17th. Well, how did capitalism survive? It started at the frontiers. And it was unusually positioned in the world that it could move to the tropics, the slaving frontiers, the sugar frontiers, to the Caribbean. It could move to the tropics in a way that was difficult or impossible for other civilizations. China is probably the closest comparator with its link between temperate and tropical zones. And indeed, that probably explains why China doesn't go of the world. China's environmental history is characterized by a much greater degree of sustainability and complementarity. But for capitalist Europe, there was a drive to the frontier and to the tropics. And this was crucial to putting nature to work. In environmentalist thought, we have many terms for degradation, destruction, entropy, but really, all of those are fundamental. All of those need to be fundamental to our analyses. We need to understand how the capitalism does not work because it does terrible things to the web of life. It does terrible things to the web of life, but it works, it accumulates capital because it can put humans and the rest of nature to work for very low cost. That just suggests that that dynamic, that cost reduction nature strategy is now coming to an end, not just because of climate change in the 20th century, although that is a major factor. It is also because of what I call capitalism's triple helix, that it is credit or debt, conquest, and coerced labor. Here is a very stylized painting of the fall of Malaga in 1487. It is pointing out that Christopher Columbus was present at the fall of Malaga, that every single one of the city's Jewish and Muslim inhabitants sold into slavery to satisfy the gypsies under the Reconquista. That was a pattern that would be replicated again and again and again on an incomparably larger scale across the ensuing 4 centuries, all the way to the end of the 19th century. This was also linked to the New World genocides, which were not just about the exchange of diseases and Alfred Crosby's sense that it was also about the reorganization of human and extra-human natures in service to capital accumulation. The result, as we know, was genocide. Everybody knows this. So that's not the interesting part. The interesting part of this story is that genocide was so severe that the people died, the forests grow back, and lead to a carbon drawdown, a carbon absorption of such an extent that it contributes by 1610, according to Louis Maslin, it contributes to the little ice age, this long old 17th century. This is what they call the orbis, or global spike, a downward spike in this case of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. So this is the first moment of capital-agenic climate change in human history. So this is very important to keep in mind, because this was the first climate crisis that capitalism experienced. It was also the formative moment of capitalism. It was a moment of profound political instability. Each one of these numbers is a revolt, a revolution, a major episode of social and political unrest. Here I draw on Jeffrey Parker's important work. How did capitalism escape? Well, a big part of the story is the move towards the tropics, as I mentioned, and enslaving sugar and slavery. This is important for a great many reasons, but one I will highlight is that the capital formation for England's industrial revolution at the end of the 18th century comes from the West Indian sugar plantations. The industrial model of the modern factory is organized on sugar, first in the countrysides of New World, on the sugar plantation. The model for industrialization is not an urban, it is an agrarian and slavery model. So this means we have to put race, we have to put natures of every kind, we have to put capital and class at the center of our understanding of what would become fossil capital. Fossil capital only emerges through the racialized divisions of labor, the world color line that forms across these centuries. So this is how capitalism escaped and fixed its first climate crisis, which was essentially to make the globe its theater, to paraphrase Marx. Well, what about fossil capital in the Industrial Revolution? Well, first of all, we should be wary about accounts that say it all began in England, it all took place in England. I don't think so. First of all, we have to pay attention to the decisive technological innovation of the era, which was not the steam engine, but the cotton gin, which was possible, the steam engine. And the cotton gin only works in the American South because of course, African slavery and the disposition and extermination of Native peoples. This was also a process of class struggle. We've been told lately that the English Industrial Revolution and the turn towards steam power is the story of the heroic English working class, and there is truth to that characterization, but it's not just English workers who had agency. It was also the Irish who revolted in 1798. It was also African slaves who engaged in slave insurrections all across the period. So now we can move into the 20th century and we can return. We have met the enemy and he is us. That would have come as a big surprise to the Vietnamese, who had met the enemy, and it was not them, it was the American empire and the chemical and biological and terror bombings that the United States was imposing on Vietnam. The environmentalism of the rich, the blue marble environmentalism, emerged at precisely this moment. It is no accident. So we want to begin to reflect on this question: why is it easier to be homeless? Why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of the system that has created this disastrous state of affairs? And I think it has a lot to do with this motto of "we have met the enemy and he is us." You can all go home and calculate your ecological footprint based on your individual consumption. It's all about the individual, right? Well, not so fast. So the environmental imaginary of 1968 occurs during the World Revolution of the long 1960s, the most sustained and radical challenge to ruling classes around the world from from Soviet Union to the United States to Chile, of course the hot autumn in northern Italy. This is an era of profound anti-colonial and class revolt. And it is also at this moment when we get the environmentalism of which is a way to ignore the world revolution of 1968, because the problem is not capitalism and empire, and we don't need to be troubled by the Vietnamese or by workers across Europe and North America. The problem is too many people. That's a title of one of Paul Ehrlich's chapters in The Population Bomb. And so we want to think about this. Before the Anthropocene came along, there was Spaceship Earth. Spaceship Earth was, if anything, even more popular, even more influential than the Anthropocene is today. And Spaceship Earth basically said we're all in this together, and we can engineer our way out of crisis. And this was part of an imaginary that said we're all in this together. So on the one hand, we have met the enemy and he is us. On the other hand, since the enemy is us, we can all just come together to Richard Nixon refers to restore nature to its natural state. This is a cause on party and beyond factions. I think we just heard somebody say that at the United Nations, so we should maybe talk about that too. This idea that environment is beyond politics was something that Nixon understood very, very well. Of course, this was also the moment when Nixon was intensifying the bombing campaign, the illegal bombing campaign in Cambodia, especially, and dumping Agent Orange in unprecedented volumes onto the forests of Southeast Asia. So we want to ask about why is it that the population bomb, Paul Ehrlich's keynote presentation in 1968, one of the most influential environmentalist books of all time, why Paul Ehrlich, when he publishes this book in 1968, is so fixated not on Vietnam, not on social inequality, not on the American cities in open revolt, but on too many people in India. And here I won't read it, but I just want to give you a feel for the profound racial anxiety that just drips off the page of Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, where it's talking about people are everywhere and they're defecating and urinating, clinging to buses, hurting animals. They're just everywhere. It gave the whole scene a hellish aspect, he says. And it's a very striking account. It's a very vivid account. It's worth knowing that many of the key figures of the modern dominant environmental imaginary had some personal connection to India, including Ehrlich, including Garrett Hardin of Tragedy of the Commons, including Lester Brown of World Watch Institute, including key figures, the future and executive director of the Sierra Club in the United States. So they were fixated with India because it was a battleground of the Cold War. But that's not what comes out. The conflicts over inequality and poverty at the heart are erased by what Ehrlich calls the field of overpopulation. Now, the fact that they were talking about India and overpopulation and hunger has a long history that goes well beyond American hegemony after World War II. It also goes back to Winston Churchill, whose cabinet officer responsible for India said, "I see no difference between Churchill and Hitler's regional politics." Good reason. When 3 million Bengalis were starving to death in 1943, and the governments of Canada and Australia said, "We have food, we can send it and help relieve the famine," Churchill said, "No, the Indians breed like rabbits. This is not a big deal. Let them starve." Well, one of the things that struck me in this, as I was encountering this environmental imaginary, which is still very much with us in the Anthropocene, is that the idea that too many people are driving the problem is really, in the final analysis, always too many brown people. And for that reason, I say we don't live on spaceship Earth, we live on slave ship Earth. And it's worth recounting that 71% of the world's population lives on less than $10 a day. Indeed, 30% of the world on a good day are integrated into the world consumer market. For the most part, they have very, very little choice about what to consume or how to consume, even in the so-called rich countries, where most consumption is, in fact, the unpaid work of social production. What I would also say is that slave ship Earth is, while it sounds more pessimistic, I think in fact is much more optimistic, because slave ships were found rebellion and revolt in which many times ships would stumble before they could leave the shores of Africa. So this gives us a much more hopeful way of conceptualizing the planetary situation compared to spaceship Earth, in which social conflict has been erased. So what is it that we need to move towards an ecology of hope? Well, I think that we need to take seriously this imaginary mode of representation, but we always have to challenge this as well, because this doesn't explain anything. It gives us a certain representation of the geophysical problem. But we also need to combine it with other geohistorical ways of imagining and representing the crisis of a secular decline in the world rate of profit, of the now decades-long non-appearance of a new labor productivity revolution. In the 1970s, the business press and even Marxists like Ernest Mandel said a new revolution in automation will appear, and that has not materialized. Instead of a world of robot factories, have a world of shops. And not just in industry has productivity stagnated, but also in agriculture, which is really at the heart of capitalism, this relationship between and the history of agricultural revolutions producing more and more food with less labor power. That long era is now over. Climate change is part of it, but so are movements like food justice, food sovereignty, and other agrarian movements. And so we want to ask, how do we put some of these themes together so that we can begin to think seriously about the political theory of climate crisis? And I'm going to strike a different note from Wainwright and Mann in Climate Leviathan, which I think is a magnificent book. But I want to offer a different way to engage that conversation. I think first we need to understand that capitalism is not just a system of paid work, but that every moment of socially necessary labor time depends on the socially necessary unpaid work of women, nature, and color. That's one important point. The other moment that we want to keep in mind is this long history of climate change and political instability. And this is, I think the emergence of a kind of authoritarianism across the world, Erdogan in Turkey, Trump in the United States, Modi. These are signs of the kind of political crisis of ruling elites unable to deal with climate change in a geohistorical sense. And we can remind ourselves whenever we want to overstate the power and resilience of capitalism that across these centuries of climate change, there have been moments so bold and civilizational crisis. That's not a small thing. Okay, now to conclude, I want to draw out a few key points about the political crisis and what might be necessary to move forward. Here I want to present my own work as complementing that of an extraordinary set of contributions around degrowth, around Green New Deal, many other approaches that are extraordinarily useful. And I think that this is a complementary view. I don't think that we need to see these as necessarily in conflict. First of all, I think that we need to understand that this system of socially necessary labor time relies on a disproportionately greater appropriation of socially necessary unpaid work. That is always dependent on vast geographical or social frontiers of unpaid work that are now largely exhausted. Of the ongoing crisis of capital accumulation today, was evident in vast numbers of high-end real estate going vacant in places like Miami, New York City, Vancouver, etc. And 10-year Treasury bills, U.S. Treasury bills now at 1%. It's about the same for it's about the same for the Japanese. So there's this problem, this ongoing crisis of capital accumulation. We need to remind each other, and I think that now with discussions around Green New Deal, this is coming up very clearly, that human work is itself a force of nature, and that class politics are not just about work in the factory, but also about justice at home, in the field, in the biosphere, and not just justice for humans, but justice. So we can take seriously the claims and demands for justice that emerge from the movements around these three sources of work, historically, labor, feminist, and environmentalist movements, and begin to ask questions as to how they connect in a climate justice revolutionary strategy. And of course, finally, at the end, we need to ask, is this a crisis that capital can survive? I'm very skeptical that capitalism will survive. We may end up with a system that includes markets, but brings to the fore the most sort of politics from above, is the sort of neoliberal command politics driving the economy and accumulation and chain of view, but no longer providing any sense or promise of social development. So what kind of crisis is it? For sure, the end of the Holocene signals the end of the relatively stable climate that prevailed for 12,000 years. But in contrast to earlier moments of climate crisis, especially in the 17th century, there are frontiers of chief nature as a climate fix. Now, what are the lessons from the past century? The 20th century, long 20th century lessons. First, the willingness of ruling classes to allow for unprecedented climate devastations and brutality. So I think that we can expect ruling classes to allow the climate disasters to continue to unfold, especially across the global south. But as we know, that will not be contained. Many colleagues who have engaged in the refugee and labor rights struggles. The second, and this is something that I think Green New Deal and degrowth and other climate justice politics have not taken seriously, is the willingness of the imperialist forces to destroy land, life, and the forces of production. In other words, to save the village, it was necessary to destroy it, to borrow a quote from a U.S. teacher in 1960 in Vietnam. I think we also need to look very seriously at what I would call a reconstruction. In American history, reconstruction corresponds to the period after the American Civil War, when the American South was defeated. And at the close of the war, the plantation aristocracy assumed its political power and its control over the mode of production across the American South. What you see in the middle of this black and white, this etching here, is a federal army officer deployed to the American South to essentially depose the American planters who had assumed their positions of power, and to impose what was called a military reconstruction to allow for democratization across the American South, allow African Americans the right to vote. And for a period of about a decade, there was unprecedented political equality in which African Americans were to Congress and to the Senate and to other political posts at every level. We have a map of the greatest engineering project ever undertaken in human history, the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, which is very much an example of American state capitals planning. And we also need to take seriously this statement to save the village, it was necessary to destroy it. And for the Nazis, it wasn't about saving the villages, it was about ethnic cleansing and social practices. So I want to remind colleagues and comrades that the greatest contribution to human well-being and environmental sustainability in the 20th century was the Soviet destruction, Nazis. We have to take that very seriously. None of these are models, let me say, but they raise thorny problems that I think cannot be resolved through anti-statism or small is beautiful approaches in an era where all classes have shown an unprecedented willingness to release the forces of destruction on its political opponent. So here's the three conclusions. We need to engage climate change, not just geophysically, to build the geophysical into our geohistorical construction, especially to the set of the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, apartheid. We need to support ontological demands for a different kind of core deeds as a single package: decarbonization, democratization, decommodification, demilitarization. So we need to look at the best of justice, climate justice, the other movements to abolish borders, for instance, presenting these ontological demands in which all of these questions are linked. And then I think we need to decolonize our environmental imaginaries and draw lessons, not romantic versions of these, but to draw sober and critical lessons from socialist reconstructions, because in the century ahead, every city next to a coastline will have to be rebuilt. The electrical grids, the water systems, the food delivery systems, agricultural models, everything will have to be rebuilt, rethought, and reconstructed. Thank you very much.
So, Jason.
Okay, am I back now? Can you see me? Yes. Yes, okay.
Many thanks for your so brief and simple speech. Without no deep historical, with no historical profundity. So very, very simple. And sì. And so I don't know, because now we can debate some minutes. If we can debate some minutes if we want. I think we can debate 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and we can start with Stefania Barca that help us to begin this debate, this discussion. Not so a brief discussion.
Yeah.
Some minutes less than Jason Moore speech. And okay. Grazie Jason, maintenance. So yes, Stefania now.
Stefania.
Hi, Jason. Thank you very much for being with us at this time of your night. And
It's mine.
Yeah, and I hope you'll feel better soon.
I will. I wish I could be there.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so I will try to take 5 minutes, if that's okay with
Ti
enough.
abbraccio, ti voglio bene.
Right. So I have a couple of points. Well, yours was very rich. I took lots of notes, but I want to challenge you a little bit on a couple of points. Okay.
Good.
Right. So the first thing I wanted to highlight from your speech is the part when you say that nature is a project of capitalist modernity, because I think that is a very, very powerful concept, and one for which I myself and I think many, many people are grateful to you, because it allows us to conceptualize revolution and ecological revolution. And in fact, this is the point where you yourself go from there by saying that nature then becomes a terrain of class struggle. And this struggle is basically around the definition of limits. And from there, you mentioned your idea of ecological revolution. Now, here, I really appreciate you including class in the idea of ecological revolution, because as you may recall, when Carolyn Merchant conceptualized it in her book, Ecological Revolutions, she talked about the interaction between production, reproduction, and consciousness and ecology, of course. But she did not, and of course, her view being based on a Marxist understanding of science included class, but did not include class struggle and a vision of how this interaction between production, reproduction, ecology, and consciousness could be changed, could be transformed by revolutionary subjects. So the revolutionary subject was missing. So I think this is very important. But my challenge here is when you, soon after that, you mentioned Marx's understanding of the relationship between labor and nature. And I think, although this is very key to eco-socialist visions, and of course it is very important to talk about that, I think we need to think about and talk about the limits of Marx's view of the relationship between labor and nature. Because in my understanding, that Marx's understanding was productivist. It was focused on production work, and it did, in fact, exclude, as feminists, and even Marxist feminists have pointed out, how that vision excluded an understanding of reproductive labor. and care labor, etc. And I would add today, we could even talk about unproductive labor and how, I mean, this is something really to, I would say, a new frontier. But let's stay with the reproductive for now, and say that we do need to redefine class and class struggle as not centered uniquely around production, but including reproduction labor, because that is missing from the Marxist own perspective. And this is key to a feminist understanding, a feminist view of ecological revolution and what ecological revolution is all about. And I think you do give important suggestions on how to do that, especially towards the end of your speech. You talk about this work energy tripartite categorization of paid work, human unpaid work, and non-human work. And this is something really important, and that has been also is convergent with the feminist and especially materialist ecofeminism visions. So I think we have to start from there. That's not a point of arrival, that's a point of departure for reconceptualizing eco-socialism in a feminist perspective. This was basically my point. My 5 minutes are over, so I have many other things I want to discuss with you, but we'll do it in some other time. Thank you, Jason.
That's great. Should I reply or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think, I mean, what has become eco-socialism is something that I'm not sure I want to be a part of. And for precisely the reasons that you indicate, that it tends to have a kind of Marxological flavor to it in which people debate over what Marx really argued or what he didn't. For me, Marx is useful because he is historical, he's materialist, and he has a method, a philosophy of internal relations that allows us to do precisely what you just brilliantly outlined, which of course is completely my perspective as well, that that for me in Web of Life, the inversion was precisely to take to make the relations of production within the money economy dependent on the relations of reproduction in the human amongst humans and the rest of nature. And so if we do that, I think it fundamentally changes our understanding of capitalism and of the class struggle and of what a socialist strategy in an era of climate crisis will need to do. Because the logical, from what you just said, and this is my own analysis as well, is that the dynamics of climate patriarchy are such that combined with neoliberalism and the simultaneous sort of appropriation and exploitation of women across the world through the second shift, and what Melissa Wright talks about, the third world disposable figure of the third world woman as central to neoliberal accumulation, is such that the climate justice struggle will find the dynamics of climate patriarchy absolutely fundamental. So the danger, and you're not doing it, I mean, we're on the same page, is that there is a kind of decolonial moment that wants to decolonize without having a conception of class and class structure and class struggle. And so this conversation can, and I see part of it, I'm so enthusiastic about your work that we need the most radically feminist approach to historical materialism in an age of climate crisis that we can possibly do.
Thank you.
So, 1,000 times yes.
Jason? Emanuele? And then the microphone is open for 15 minutes.
Okay, just because the timing on the program seems different, but
Okay, Jason.
I will take 5 minutes to.
Okay,
Yes,
Okay, Jason.
Okay.
15 minutes.
okay.
So you go to sleep.
Very good.
È vero, sono le 5 del mattino.
Good night, Jason. Thank you for being with us. And well, first of all, let me just say that a good chunk of the discussion we have been having this morning can be found in the special issue of Sociologi Urbana e Rurale, which is going to be out in a month or so. So if you are interested, be sure to check it out because it's there. And then to Jason's, yeah, it eventually will turn into a question, but it's for the moment just a quick commentary, because I do think that the main payoff of your analysis, critical analysis of the popular Anthropocene, is that it allows us to rethink the relationship between inequality and environmental preservation or climate stability, and especially in relation to your tripartite, task in the present. So climate class divide, climate apartheid, and climate apartheid. I wonder, what do you think about the recent debate, which actually is involving sociologists both in Europe and in the US, about the Green New Deal? Especially as it stands, but also if you have any thought about what it can become, if it can be actually useful to the climate movement which is rising these days. Because I have the impression that it will be an issue we'll discuss in this conference and for the coming moment. Thanks.
Well, it's a fantastic question. The Green New Deal is hugely important as a conversation because it is bringing together one of the great schisms on the left over the past 50 years, which is between labor and environment. So in that sense, it is to be welcomed, it is to be supported at every turn. We are, of course, I think all of us are aware of the limits of this way of thinking. I am not convinced that the metaphor is a good one. I am convinced that the conversation is good, and I'm supporting my colleagues and comrades who are building out the conversation. There's a danger that it will be national instead of internationalist. There's a danger that it will be technocratic without being democratic in a popular mobilization sense. There is a sense that it will simply reproduce, there is a real danger that it will simply reproduce a version of green capitalism, because insofar as the accumulation fund for building carbon neutral infrastructure is controlled by private capital, it will be green capitalism. So there needs to be a democratically controlled accumulation fund, or it will end up being green capitalism. That's a very real danger. The historical experience of the Green New Deal is not something that I'm particularly, the historical experience of the New Deal in the 1930s is mixed. It is uneven. It was a period of where the Communist Party in the United States demobilized and supported the Democratic Party. It was not a particularly effective way of solving the unemployment crises of the Great Depression. In 1940, 15% of the American workforce is out of work. What solves the problem is wartime mobilization. But I'm also mindful that if there was a politics that supported a more radical version of the Green New Deal and that supported and allowed for a democratically controlled accumulation fund to come into existence, that would also set in motion the forces of counter-revolution. And I don't mean this in an abstract way. I mean, if we look at the experience of the to 1975, where a whole series of social democratic governments were either removed from office or pushed out of office in one way or another. That's an instructive experience. In Australia, the Whitlock Social Democratic Labour government is removed by the Queen's Governor General in 1975. I think in 76, the Wilson Labour government in the United Kingdom is removed, and what is now widely regarded as a kind of MI6 CIA coup. Olaf Palme's Social Democrats, who had toyed with the idea of expropriating capital by peaceable means, but still expropriating, were pushed out of office. In Chile, the Allende government is, of course, militarily deposed. So we need to be very clear about the political challenges ahead, and we don't have the answers. But I think that simply saying the Green New Deal need to invest in carbon neutral infrastructure is a place to begin. But it's also going to require us to make some very sober and hard political choices as we move ahead, or we will be vulnerable to the same kinds of counter-revolutionary and counterinsurgent campaigns that we've seen for the past century.
Okay, so we have some questions or commentaries to Jason Moore conference. No? Jason, so
Yes, sir.
now we have to study.
Yes.
About
Oh, struggle. Study and struggle.
Okay, so you from us, and good night now.
Okay, thank you, and it is an honor. Thank you for allowing me to.
I send an email you tomorrow. È andato. Ma va a dormire veramente. No, era a casa. C'ha la stanza come il dipartimento.
Dorme lì.
Non sappiamo se la arreda lui o se la arreda Diana.
Sì, ma è uguale.
Perché l'idea è che Diana faccia molto unpaid work, quindi ora...
T'ho bloccato le mie.
Allora, come siamo messi? Ora andiamo tutti insieme e tutte insieme al primo piano.